I did not tell them that. So I'm not 100% sure how I got into science fiction, because my parents were telling me these things because I was already a science fiction fan. And thinking about it, I think probably what happened was, when I say my parents, I mean my mother and my stepfather. My stepfather was very much my real dad. He raised me, but there was another parent, a biological parent, who, when I was about 4 years old, this will tell you how old I am. When I was a child, of course, the only way you could see a movie was to go to the theater to see it. You couldn't watch it on your television at home unless it was a special thing that the network was going to show a movie. And so when I was about 4, maybe almost 5, the movie 2001 was coming for a special engagement to be shown in the town where I was growing up. And the parent who had custody of me that weekend wanted to go see 2001, but there was no one to watch me while that happened. And so I ended up at 4 years old in the theater watching 2001 on the big screen. Now, I know plenty of adults who have seen that movie for the first time and have no idea what's going on. So little 4-year-old me, I did not have a chance of understanding anything. But what really stayed with me for a very long time, even when I was very small, was Hal. Especially that scene where Dave is taking out the memory banks and Hal is saying, "I'm afraid," and then he starts to sing "A Bicycle Built for Two." Boy, that stays with you forever, doesn't it? And I suspect it was from that traumatic experience that I was imprinted with science fiction, much to my parents' dismay.
Ah, ça c'est normal, c'est forcément un désespoir. Mais donc, assez vite vous est venue, je crois, l'envie d'écrire des histoires. Peut-être pas tout de suite des histoires de science-fiction. Alors, j'ai lu un certain nombre d'interviews. Dans l'une d'entre elles, vous allez nous dire si c'est quelque chose de significatif ou pas. J'ai vu que vous aviez eu, dans vos premières envies d'écrire, l'idée d'écrire ce qu'on trouvait dans des magazines, des histoires qui étaient peut-être plus de la romance, en tout cas de la littérature générale. Et est-ce que c'est un projet qui ne vous stimulait pas assez? Est-ce que vous avez eu envie de le prolonger ou vous êtes passé tout de suite à la science-fiction?
So yeah, I did want to write from when I was a small child. And my parents encouraged me in this, actually. They felt that I was talented, and they encouraged me to write. What I wanted was to get money for my writing. That would mean I was a professional writer. And where I lived, there were no science fiction magazines I would go into the drugstore, and there would be lots of magazines, but none of them were science fiction magazines. So even though I wanted to write science fiction, I did not think that I could get money for writing science fiction, or I didn't know how. But I knew from my parents telling me that I could look in the front of any magazine and find the submission guidelines and the address for where to send submissions. So at the time, there was a line of magazines in the US. They had titles like True Confessions and True Romance and True Love and True Stories, and they were all romance stories, and they were all meant to be sort of shocking, but not so shocking that anything really horrible would actually happen. Usually the way these stories would go would be, we would say something terrible was about to happen, but then it would turn out to be everything was okay, right? And then they would kiss at the end and it would be great. And it's not my favorite kind of story. Obviously a lot of people love these stories, which is cool, but I wasn't one of them. But so what I did was I said, I want money for my writing, and I'm willing to write anything if someone will give me money for it. So I went to the store and I bought a big stack of these magazines, and I read them and I read them and I read them until I knew what kind of story they wanted. And then I sat down to the typewriter. This is how long ago that was. It was actually a typewriter. It was my mother's old portable Olivetti. And I wrote a story that was going to be like all the stories that I had read, and I sent it in, and they bought it. They actually paid me money for this. And so I said, oh, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can be a writer. And then I thought, so all I need to do is write another story like that. And I thought, I didn't like writing that story. I didn't like reading the stories that helped me write the story. I don't like this kind of story. It's not my kind of thing. And so I said, you know what, it's not worth going through all that and then not enjoying it. And that was actually a very important lesson for me, because later on in life, and it still happens now, I would be presented with a story, even inside fantasy and science fiction, that isn't making me happy to write, that I'm not enjoying, but maybe someone will give me money for it. And the question is it worth it to me to put out a story I'm not proud of and I don't love, even if I get money for it? What's more valuable there, that I'm happy with what I've done or that I've gotten a little bit of money? And for me, everybody's going to make their own decision about that. There isn't a right or a wrong way to answer that question, but for me, I discovered very early on that it was important to me that I be very proud of the work that I was doing and that the money was less important to me.
Et donc, pendant les années qui ont suivi, à partir de 2005 à peu près, vous avez commencé à publier régulièrement des nouvelles de science-fiction. Est-ce que vous avez trouvé cette satisfaction que vous espériez dans l'écriture de la nouvelle, ou est-ce que dès le départ, vous avez eu le projet de vous lancer dans un roman en considérant que c'était plus ambitieux, plus satisfaisant? En France, en tout cas, on parle beaucoup de la difficulté d'avoir des débouchés pour les nouvelles. Qu'est-ce qui vous a motivé dans le passage à un projet plus ambitieux?
I actually started out writing a novel. The very first serious science fiction and fantasy project was a novel, and in fact it was in the Raj universe. I had already had the idea for Ancillary Justice, but I was afraid of it. It was too difficult and intimidating. So I sort of wrote a story around the edges. And when I was done, I actually submitted it to some places, and of course it was rejected because it is dreadful. Believe me, it is really an awful novel. And now I'm very glad that nobody bought it. And so having done that, I said, you know, it takes a long time to write a novel, and it takes a long time to submit. Sometimes you submit a novel someplace, and it will be in their mailbox for a year or more. But short stories, it's a much shorter time to write one. And there are a number of places. By then I had found what the names of some of the magazines were, and the more I looked, the more magazines I found. And they'll send you your story back with a rejection in a month or two, which is much easier. And at least in the US, historically, in science fiction, the sort of expected path was that you would write short stories first and sell those and learn your skills that way and build up a reputation, and then you would sell a novel, having worked your way up to the novel. That's not actually the way it works all the time, but that's the narrative of how it's supposed to happen. So I said, well, I'll put the novel aside and I will focus on the short stories. And so I did that for several years, and it took me a while to learn to write shorter. That was very difficult because I was used to having all this space to spread out and put in all the cool stuff. In short stories, you have to make them very targeted, very aimed. Nothing is in the short story except what contributes to the ending of the short story, so that you can fit it in that very small space. And that was very difficult. And eventually, I worked my way down to a story of 300 words, which I sold. I was very proud of myself. That was as short as I ever went. And then I said, all right, I've done that. I've done that, so now I'm going to go back to the novel, because if I don't write it, I'm never going to write it. And so I set the short stories aside and I went back to the novels.